Hello. It is good to see everybody. I am thankful for the opportunity to speak to you all this morning. I was considering this lesson for a long time, and it took me a while to prepare it, just because it's a cool story. This morning, I would like the opportunity to tell you the story of Esther. And just this sermon will be a little bit different than what I usually do. I just want to tell you this story. It's so unique in that it never mentions God by name, but you can see his work everywhere in this story. So it's 10 chapters long, and we're going to read all of it. No, we're not going to do that. I will summarize, and hopefully we'll get out at a reasonable time. If we cut into the Bible class, I don't think too many people will mind. We'll see. So Esther, if you would like to follow along, let's just listen to the story of Esther. And I want you to think about the purpose of Esther. And if you would like a parallel story, maybe think about how this ties into a story like Joseph, the story of Joseph, and how God worked throughout the life of Joseph to bring him exactly where he needed to be in the moment that he needed to be there. So, Esther, starting in chapter 1, we are introduced to King Ahasuerus. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but I'll do the best I can. King Ahasuerus, he threw a massive feast for 180 days. I can't imagine. And if that wasn't enough, immediately he threw a second feast for 7 days. There was all kinds of partying and drinking and feasting, and we're told the king let everybody do whatever they wanted to do. After that, during the 7-day feast, Queen Vashti at the time also gave a feast for the women in the palace. And on the last day of the feast, the king called for his queen. He wanted to show her off. He asked her to dance in front of his guests. And she refused. She didn't want to do this. The king became angry, and this became a big deal. His advisors told him, "You need to do something about this because this could spread to marriages everywhere. If women find out, there could be an uprising," right? So the king, in his moment of fury, stripped the queen of her title and banished her. She was not to come before the king ever again. And then we see in chapter 2, after the king's anger subsided, he thought better of this. He started missing his queen. And his eunuchs and attendees had a great idea. Well, let's get a new queen. So they sent out a proclamation throughout the land. They looked for all of the young, eligible women. They gathered them up, and they were brought before the king. And it's at this moment that we are introduced to Mordecai the Jew. And this is very interesting. The way we are introduced to Mordecai was as a man who was taking care of a young woman named Hadassah. Her other name, which we know more commonly as Esther. Now, Mordecai was taking care of Esther because she had no parents. This was during the time, or shortly after, the Jews were taken into captivity under Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. So the Jews were in captivity. Esther had no parents, and Mordecai decided to raise her. If I'm remembering correctly, Esther is the daughter of Mordecai's uncle, so they were a close relative. Esther was she is described as very beautiful, and she was immediately taken under custody into the palace. Now, there are three things that we are told that the author of Esther wants you to kind of tuck away in the back of your mind as you read the rest of the story, because they're going to come up later. This is very cool how this story is written. So these three things. We are told in chapter 2 that under penalty of death, only those who are called at the appointed times could visit the king. Right? If you are not called, if the king has not called you, and you try to see the king, you're gone. The next thing is Esther kept her nationality a secret. She was told by Mordecai, hey, it could go bad for you if you let people know that you're a Jew. Don't tell anyone. And the third thing, at the end of chapter 2, we find out that as Esther is inside the palace, Mordecai is sitting by the gate, and he overhears a couple of the king's eunuchs planning to assassinate the king. Mordecai finds out, and he tells somebody, and he thwarts their plan. This is recorded in a book, and that's all we're told about it for now. So remember these three things. Chapter 3, we are introduced to the villain of the story, Haman. Now, Haman was gaining rank. He is becoming an incredibly important person in the kingdom. Everyone would bow down to Haman, except for Mordecai. This made Haman so angry. He was revered everywhere except for this one man. Mordecai would not bow down to him. And that's because of Mordecai's faith. He would only bow down to the Lord. So, Haman came up with a plan, and he decided to trick the king, or to be very sneaky, to tell the king that there's a nation of people within his kingdom that are causing all kinds of trouble. They're terrible people. We should annihilate them. We should kill them. We should destroy them. The king thinks this is a great idea. It might say something that they were both getting drunk at the time, but they thought this was a good idea. So the king agrees to it, and he gives Haman all the resources, all the money that he needs to carry out this great plan. The date is set. The announcement is made. It goes throughout the kingdom. And we are told in Susa, the capital city, when the announcement is made, it throws the whole city into confusion. And while the city is in confusion, Haman and the king are off partying. Chapter 4. Mordecai learns about this plot to destroy the Jews, and he is rightfully upset about it. He tears his clothes, he puts on sackcloth, and he cried bitterly in the open square. Esther also finds out, and she is deeply distressed. Esther and Mordecai send messages to each other. They can't see each other directly, but they are sending messages between each other through the eunuchs. And they start talking. Mordecai commanded Esther to plead with the king. And Esther lets Mordecai know, if I do this, I could die. You're not allowed to come and see the king unless you're called. I haven't been called for at least a month. It's not my time. And Mordecai says the famous words which were written earlier, they were read to us earlier, that if Esther chooses at this moment not to speak up, salvation for the Jews will come from somewhere. But her and her people will not be safe inside the palace. The idea is, this great city, this palace that you are living in, is not going to save you. That's not what's going to save you. And if you choose not to speak up, salvation will come for the Jews. You're going to be destroyed. And who knows if God has put you here in this moment, in this place, for this reason. So Esther tells Mordecai, gather up the Jews in Susa, fast for 3 days, don't eat and don't drink, and pray for 3 days. And after 3 days, I will do the same with me and the women who attend to me. We will fast. After the 3 days, I will go and I will approach the king. And if I perish, I perish. And we're left at the end of chapter 4. So chapter 5, Queen Esther prepares herself. She approaches the king. The king extends the scepter, which it means that he accepts her. So her life is no longer in danger. And the king asks her, what is your request? And she tells the king, please come into my home. I've prepared a feast for you and for Haman. Come and eat with me. And the king accepts. He gets Haman and they go to eat with Esther. Haman is kind of excited at this point. He thinks, what a special honor. I have been invited to dine with the king and queen. During the feast, the king asks again, what can I do for you? What's your request? And Esther tells them, come back tomorrow. I will prepare another feast, and then I will let you know what my request is. So after the feast, Haman goes home, and he is so excited. He is overjoyed. He is thinking, I am this great important person. Everyone respects me. I just ate with the king and queen. Everything is going my way. And he passes by Mordecai, which ruins everything. Haman on his way home passes by Mordecai, and Mordecai does not bow down. He doesn't acknowledge him. This fills Haman with a fury, and he calls his friends and his wife to go home and to eat and to drink so that he can complain. Everybody loves me, but Mordecai the Jew, what a terrible, terrible human being. He also brags about all the things that are going well in his life. And when he gets around to complaining about Mordecai, his wife has an idea and says, hey, why don't you build some gallows outside our house? That'll shut up Mordecai. Haman thinks this is a great idea, so he calls some servants and he has gallows built outside of his home with the idea that he will go tomorrow morning and convince the king that Mordecai needs to die. Now we are also told at the same time, so Haman just went to go to his house. At the same time, the king goes and he can't sleep. It's nighttime and he can't sleep. So of course, what do you do when you can't sleep? Well, you read something boring. He calls for his servants to read to him some history, some events that had gone on previously in the kingdom. And it just so happens that they come across the story of Mordecai thwarting the assassination plot of the king. And the king says, this is great news. Hey, what was done for this guy? What was done for Mordecai for saving my life? Was there any reward given to him? And his servants say, no, nothing was done. Nothing was done to him. He wasn't rewarded for this. Now, at that very moment, Haman is coming through the king's gate. He is on the way to convince the king Mordecai needs to die. And the king just finished hearing this story about Mordecai, how he saved his life. Haman comes through the door, and the first thing the king says is, hey, Haman, just the guy I wanted to see. What should I do to the man whom I wish to honor? And Haman is thinking, oh, this is me. This could be no one else. The king has been giving me all of this authority, all of this attention. There's nobody else that the king would like to honor except for me. So he names all of these things. Oh, the king should do this, put on the robe and carry him through the city, shouting, this is what happens to the king, to the person the king delights to honor. And the king turns around and says, yes, let's do that. Go and do that to Mordecai the Jew. And Haman sinks. His emotions are on this crazy roller coaster. But he goes and he does it. He goes and he grabs Mordecai. He puts on the robe. He puts him on the animal, takes him through the city, shouting praise to Mordecai throughout the capital city. Afterwards, Mordecai goes on his way, and Haman goes home to pout. Like, you can't make this stuff up. So, Haman's wife and his wise men, they take note of this. Haman comes home, he reports what just happened, and his wife and his wise men who attend to him, they take note and they say, hold on a second. Now we've heard of these Jews. And if this is starting to happen, it looks like you're in some trouble. It looks like your end is coming. There's some foreshadowing here. Haman is called to the feast, the second feast, with the king and queen Esther. So in chapter 7, they begin drinking after they ate, and the king asks Esther again, what is her request? And Esther, her request is for the life of herself and for her people. Because they had been sold out, not just for slavery. She says, if we had just been sold out to slavery, I wouldn't even ask you for anything. But there is an evil villain who wants to destroy us. And the king says, who is this that wants to destroy you and your people? And Esther turns and points and says, this villain, Haman. And Haman is white as a ghost, thinking, oh no, I'm done for. The king is furious, and he leaves the feast. He goes out into the outer court, into the gardens, and we're told about Esther and Haman in the room by themselves, and Haman is pleading for his life. He knows he's in for it. The king comes back in after a few minutes, and he sees this, and he thinks, what now? Haman is assaulting my wife. Get this guy out of here. They put a bag over Haman's head, and the eunuchs, the eunuchs the eunuchs put the bag over his head, and the king orders Haman to be hung. The eunuchs are the one that point out, hey, Haman just built some gallows by his house. We can use that. So the king thinks, yeah, this will do. Let's take care of him. And they do. So chapter 8, King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther everything that belonged to Haman. Esther made known to the king her connection to Mordecai the Jew. And we're told there are so many details that I'm leaving out because we just don't have time. Read this story. It's great. The details, Mordecai is sitting outside the gate, and he checks on Esther all the time. I'm sure the king has seen this guy sitting by the gate. So Esther makes known, hey, this guy Mordecai, the one who saved your life, we're connected. He's like my dad, my guardian. And the king thinks this is great. The king takes the signet ring, his signet ring, that previously he had given to Haman. He takes it and gives it to Queen Esther. And he gives her instruction. Esther pleads with the king to revoke the previous edict. And under their laws, the king can't take back something that was already ordered. But the king gives the queen the authority. Make a new decree. Here's my signet ring. I give you authority to write and to sign it in my name. So she does. The letters granted authority to all Jews to take up arms and defend themselves from any armed force, any people or province who might attack them. This includes children and women. Anybody who would want to attack the Jews are now able to take up arms and defend themselves. So, on the day that was prescribed, the Jews should stand ready to take vengeance on their enemies. When the Jews heard this, they were very glad. Much relief and fear of the Jews had fallen on their enemies. So on the day prescribed, the enemies of the Jews, they had hoped to gain mastery over them, but the opposite occurred. We're told on the 13th day of the month, the Jews fought against their enemies and overcame them. And in Susa, the capital city, they also fought on the 14th day. So the surrounding provinces, they fought for one day. The capital city, they fought for 2 in a row. In total, 75,000 enemies of the Jews were killed. The 10 sons of Haman were also killed. But an important note that is repeated a few times, the Jews never took any of the plunder. And I think that's important because the Jews were not interested in the money. It wasn't about the things. For them, they just wanted to defend themselves. So, Mordecai declared the 14th and the 15th feast days to be kept for years to come in memorial of what took place here. And in chapter 10, the very last chapter, it's like one paragraph long. It basically says the King Ahasuerus did many other great deeds, and they were recorded somewhere. And Mordecai the Jew was promoted second in rank only to the king. And he sought the welfare of his people, and he spoke peace to all his people. This is a cool story. Now, what does this have to do with us today? How can this apply to us today? I would be surprised if any of us have a direct connection to a king or even a president. But each of us have a circle of friends and family and co-workers and people around us. We touch so many lives. And the people that are in your social circle are different from the people that are in my social circle. And the things that have happened in your background that have brought you to the place where you are right now have happened for a reason. This is not an accident. Just like in the story of Esther, all those things that conveniently took place at just the right time, in just the right place, with just the right people. This is not an accident. God has designed this. God has a purpose for our life. And sometimes when you're in the middle of it, you don't know what that's going to look like. And it's only when you get towards the end of your story that you can look back and say, wow, that difficult thing that I went through in my younger years, I can see it now. I can see it now. That was very difficult. But now I know how to go through this thing with much more peace in my heart, with patience. Or maybe I can reach out to these people over here. Maybe I have something in common with this person over here because of what has happened in my life. God has a purpose for each of our lives, and He puts us in positions for a reason to touch somebody, to communicate something, to say something, to stand up for God's people. I also think it's interesting, and you can make of this as you will. The Old Testament was written for our learning. And it's interesting to me that the record, the Holy Spirit inspired record of a solution against tyranny is to arm the populace. That's a side note. That's an interesting side note. God has designed you and designed your life for a reason. You know the people that you know for a reason. I don't know what that reason is. Maybe you don't know what that reason is. But the best way to go throughout your life is to see each and every opportunity as an opportunity to speak up for God's people. Now, we are in a weird place in America. We are in a weird time right now. And it's difficult to see what is going to happen, even in my generation. What's going to happen to God's people in this country? We have an opportunity right now. There are so many countries that don't have the freedom that we have to worship here without fear of persecution. So many countries. This is a unique thing. Or state-sponsored churches. We don't have that in America yet. And maybe it's difficult for us to understand this concept where the government runs the churches. And it's not about Jesus. They might talk. They might speak Jesus' name, but what they actually mean is you follow the government first and foremost. This is a real thing. We don't have that in America yet. Be grateful for this and speak up for the Lord. Speak the truth. Be prepared. You will make enemies. This is not your purpose. You're not trying to make enemies. But by speaking truth and standing up for God's people, it's going to happen. People will call you all kinds of names. It's going to happen. But you're not here to make other people happy. You are living your life for Christ. That's your purpose. That was the purpose of Esther. God put her in this position to save her people, God's people, the nation that she belonged to, that was currently living in captivity. God cares about them, and He cares about us. So this is our opportunity. And that's the lesson for today. This is the story of Esther. It's so cool. It's a short book, and I encourage you, read through it because there's so many details, little details that are so cool. If there is anything going on in your life, if there's something happening, if there is some sin that you're holding on to, if there's some anger in your heart towards a brother or a sister or something that needs forgiveness and grace, if you need to let that go, give that up to God. Or maybe there are opportunities in your life that you didn't recognize before. Look for those opportunities now. Every day, find some way to speak on behalf of God's people. Stand up for truth. Stand up for God. That's why we're here today. This is the reason that we come here on Sundays, is to worship God, encourage each other. If there's anything that we can do to encourage you, please let us know as we stand and sing.